Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this segment of our episode, we'll have an exclusive interview with the United States Special Envoy to Iran, Brian Hook. Thank you so much, Brian, for giving us the time today.
Sure. Good to be with you, Hayvi.
Appreciate it. I want to start by asking about the waivers. People were anticipating a lot of pressure, maximum pressure, as the administration has called it before, on the Iranian regime, and there were waivers for 6 months. Do those waivers include countries like Iraq, Turkey, India, the countries that Iran relies on for most of its oil revenue?
When we put in place the sanctions that were lifted under the Iran nuclear deal, it was the single largest imposition of sanctions against Iran in American history. This was an enormous campaign of economic pressure that we launched that day. We had to give a very small number of oil waivers because if we had not granted a small number of oil waivers, we might have increased oil to anywhere between $90 and $100 a barrel. When we had to make our decisions on whether to grant oil waivers, we had a very tight and fragile oil market. And so as a consequence, we really had to provide some oil relief to ensure a well-supplied and stable oil market. Looking ahead, and this has been our policy from the beginning, we are not looking to grant any exemptions or waivers from our campaign of maximum economic pressure.
What does it mean now that we have these, sanctions, we have the SWIFT system strategy, which was a major development? What type of, how tight is the situation right now on the Iranian regime? How much longer can they hold on, especially in terms of funding terrorist militias throughout the region?
Yeah, that's a good question, Hayvi. I think that they face international economic isolation. The regime does. This is really the price the regime is paying for being an outlaw regime for so many years. And we know that they have been in compliance with the Iran nuclear deal, but it sets a very low bar for compliance. And so we should not be surprised that Iran is found in compliance on a regular basis with the deal. It was a sweetheart deal for the Iranian regime. Now, you look at all the other threats to peace and security that Iran presents, and they have escalated during that period. Terrorism, terror finance, missile testing, missile aggression, cyber attacks, maritime aggression, human rights abuses. All of that has expanded during the lifetime of the Iran nuclear deal. We decided to get out of the deal because it was a bad deal and it was preventing us from addressing the entire range of threats that Iran presents. And we have disconnected them from the SWIFT, the financial messaging system, disconnected the same banks that we designated because these are corrupt banks that engage in all sorts of malign activities.
One of the part of the strategy, the American strategy, is the demand for the withdrawal of all the Iranian militias from Syria. How do you plan on implementing this part of the strategy? Because, we don't know of any way that the administration kind of explained about how to come to do this.
We do have a policy, as you said, of all forces under Iranian command and control need to leave Syria as part of an irreversible political process in Syria. This is, Iran has about 2,000 Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps and Quds Force soldiers there. They oversee about 10,000 Shia fighters. And we are not going to have a stable Syria for as long as those fighters are there. And so it's critical. Our chief diplomat, Jim Jeffrey, he is the Secretary's Special Envoy for Syria. He has made diminishing Iranian presence a big priority on his diplomacy. Our troops that you mentioned that are in Syria are there for to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. Our diplomats are there to ensure that we need to get to new elections and a new constitution, but we've got to get Iranian forces out of the country.
Iran obviously does not want the United States to stay in Syria. The United States now declared that they will be staying in Syria even after the defeat of ISIS to ensure that there is stability and there's no more ground for terrorism to flourish. Now there's threats by Turkey to attack these areas. What do you expect we're going to see as a response from the United States?
Well, you've seen the Israelis take a number of steps to make clear that they will not tolerate an Iranian forward deployed missile presence so close to Israel. We have made it very clear that in our diplomacy that Iranian forces have to leave. So I think that we've got our diplomats and Secretary Pompeo working very hard. There are a few places that are more complicated than Syria. You've got many countries who have very deep interests in that country, and we really need for the future of the Syrian people to get all the refugees back. We are going to be withholding reconstruction assistance as part of our leverage to achieve the kind of political ends that are necessary to allow people to come back to Syria and to end the fighting.
As you mentioned, Israel has been actually the only countries that's taking action, steps on the ground, targeting Iranian militias in Syria. Does the United States intend to help and support those efforts by Israel to eliminate the existence of these militias militarily?
We support Israel's right to defend itself. And so we've been very clear that Israel is acting to protect its own national security. I know that we've made that very clear to President Putin. Prime Minister Netanyahu has also made that clear to President Putin. And so we very much support Israel defending its own security.
In terms of the missiles, the system, the threats by the Iranian regime, as you mentioned earlier, I heard that, now Europe agrees with the United States on these issues, even though they disagree on the withdrawal from the nuclear deal. But is that enough? I mean, could there be a way to see in the future more collaboration between the United States and other European countries to help stop these tests and threats against the entire world?
Absolutely, yeah. We're seeing a lot more cooperation. We've been working very closely with the Europeans. I worked with them since the time I've assumed this role. And we agree on much more than we disagree. The press overstates our differences. We have a disagreement over the Iran nuclear deal. But outside of the Iran nuclear deal, we share a very similar threat assessment on terrorism, on regional aggression, missile testing, missile proliferation, the arbitrary detention of citizens by the regime. Britain has British citizens who've been held hostage by the regime, and so do we. And so the December 1st medium-range ballistic missile test, a missile that's capable of carrying multiple warheads, this is hurting the Iranian regime's standing in Europe and beyond. I was in the Security Council yesterday with Secretary Pompeo. 11 of the 15 council members, plus Germany and the European Union, all echoed our threat assessment around missile testing, missile proliferation, and regional aggression.
My last question, just the vision of handling Iran as a threat, as an international threat. Do you think this administration is basically agreeing? There's a consensus between the State Department, Secretary Mattis. We hear there's not a coherent strategy or agreement on how to handle the Iran question.
Oh, I think we've seen a really good national security cabinet work together. You have the Department of State's working on diplomacy. Our Department of Treasury, Secretary Mnuchin, is helping us with economic pressure. State has oil in trying to get Iran imports to zero. And then we also have Secretary Mattis, who is helping us restore deterrence against a lot of the aggression from Shia militias. We don't make a distinction between the Iranian government and the Shia militias that they organize, train, and equip.
Does that include Hezbollah? Sorry.
Yes, well, we don't make, in terms of, Iran gives Hezbollah $700 million a year. And today, your average Hezbollah fighter makes more money than your average Iranian firefighter. And that is something which the Iranian people understand. And they know how this regime robs its own people blind in order to fund revolutionary activities around the Middle East as they try to create this Shia corridor of control. Iran really needs to be at peace with its neighbors. They're under no direct threat from their neighbors, and they really need to be at peace with them. The problem is that this is a revolutionary regime which can't stop behaving like a revolutionary regime We are trying to change that cost benefit against their favor so that they see that it's really not in their national interest to keep behaving like an outlaw regime. It's very bad on the Iranian people. This regime has made Iran an international pariah.
Thank you so much, Brian Hook, for giving us the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hayvi.
Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this part of our episode, we'll be talking to Nader Uskowi, Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, about his new book, Temperature Rising, Iran's Revolutionary Guards and Wars in the Middle East. And we'll be discussing with him the latest information on the Iran sanctions, the state of the Iranian economy, and the chances of escalation between Israel and Hezbollah. Thank you so much, Nader, for joining us once again.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I want to actually start with your new book. You
Yes.
published a new book about Iran. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, the book is about the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, IRGC, and their extraterritorial branch, the Quds Force, and basically tells the story of how the organization came into being after Islamic Revolution in Iran, and also how organization evolved into the present-day Quds Force, and how it got involved into all major regional wars, like in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and presence all over the world. So that's the story of that.
I'm sure that means that Qasem Soleimani is a big part of your book.
Well, Qasem Soleimani is in the book, of course, because he commanded the IRGC Quds Force,
yes.
and the recent times. Of course, he's a major part of that. But it's not just Qasem Soleimani. It's really IRGC is the headquarters of the Shia militancy based on the revolutionary doctrine of the Islamic Republic, goes back all the way to Khomeini days. And actually, we find a lot of surprises researching on that point.
Who are the other leaders from the IRGC that you mentioned in the books that are immense danger, basically, to the world that we live in today? That they're behind all the planning, the operations that they launch everywhere, the collaboration with Hezbollah, with Al-Houthis, all of the above?
Well, the whole organization, IRGC, concentrates on inside the country. The Quds Force concentrate outside the country as the extraterritorial branch of the IRGC. And as far as the people outside Iran are concerned, especially people in Middle East, and not just the Middle East, the whole globe really, because they have reached the whole globe, is the IRGC Quds Force who are creating the actual clear and present danger for the West and Western allies in the region.
The Quds Force are the main threat.
Yes.
Do you see that they are in a stage now, according to your book, that they are devolved from a peak that they've reached at some point, or are they still in that same peak?
That's a great question. The Quds Force's involvement in the conflict peaked in Syria, actually. I would say it peaked in Battle of Aleppo in late 2016. At the time, when the civil war started in Syria, the Iranian supreme leaders and the Iranian leadership said that they're going to help Assad, to save Assad, and to oppose the moderate Sunni opposition. Well, the Quds Force did that. They did it with the help of recruiting almost 50,000 Shia militias from different countries in the region, including Iraq, in Bahrain, in other parts of the Arab world, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. They gathered a lot of Shia militias together under the commands of the Quds Force to fight, to save Assad and to fight the Sunni moderate opposition in Syria. Well, after the Battle of Aleppo, they basically reached that kind of a goal because Assad was, from their point of view, at least for a time being, was saved. And the moderate Sunni opposition were driven out of the main areas of the battle space, main battle spaces.
And that was the help of Russia, obviously, but on the ground
Well,
it was the Quds force.
On the ground was the Quds force. The Quds force had their own, about 2,000 personnel in Syria, their own general officers and other more junior officers on the ground to lead the Shia militias. They had at the Battle of Aleppo, they had about 55,000 up to 80,000, depending to different phases of the battle of the Shia militias, including Lebanese Hezbollah, including the Iraqi militias, including the Pakistani and Afghan militias as their ground force, if you will. They had also brought in elements of the regular Artesh, regular army from Iran, and regular IRGC from Iran, units like armor, like artillery, like ballistic missile, like UAV. They brought those from Iran on that battle space.
So that was the biggest ground war.
It was the biggest war. They didn't have the Air Force, and Putin gave them the Air Force with open arms. So that was the Russian Air Force that became their Air Force. They covered that part. But that basically that was the height of the Quds Force involvement in the region. You expected that they would, after Aleppo, in early 2017, they would call it a victory and leave. No, they stayed. Now they wanted to have permanent bases inside Syria. Now they wanted to house the Shia militias inside those permanent bases. They wanted to keep ballistic missiles inside Syria and UAVs and special forces, this time to challenge Israel. And that's where they changed their strategy, and their strategy was really against their own doctrine. Their doctrine was not to get involved with superior forces, to fight proxy war, not getting involved directly with the superior force. But that's exactly what happened. They got to challenge Israel. Israel started challenging them. And if you remember, in early May, Israel had a vast attack on Iran, on Quds Force-led forces inside Syria, destroyed almost all of their facilities in Syria, and the Quds Force could not even respond, could not even launch any counter-offensive or retaliation against Israeli attacks. And I think that shows that they have reached their web. They are good fighting Sunni, moderate Sunni, who are not really military force, but when it comes to major superior forces like Israel, they have to watch them to destroy them.
Exactly. And what about today? Today, when we have, the rebels also were driven out of Daraa, there are claims that Iran has its bases all around Syria, but also in the south, near Damascus. And we see the continuation of the Israeli airstrikes against them.
I mean, the Iranians have made a decision. They want to stay in Syria. They are in no way, in no hurry to leave Syria. That's their long-term strategy, long-term goal. And yes, tactically, they might withdraw from one battle space or one battlefront and concentrate on other battlefronts within Syria. But the strategy is to stay in Syria. After all, Quds means Jerusalem. They created the force originally after the revolution to challenge Israel, and they needed the missing link for them to be near the Israeli forces, were Syria. Now they're in Syria, they're not going to leave. They're going to stay in Syria for long. Now, they might do some tactics like embedding their people or embedding their Shia militia who are Arabs within the within the Syrian structures, within the Syrian intelligence, the Syrian military. So you might see them wearing even Assad's uniforms to continue that fight. But they are not going to leave Syria. They're going to be the greatest menace to the future of Syria.
What do you think, Nader, the resolution for something like this? And could Israel, with its strategy also to not tolerate Iranians' presence in Syria, could Israel alone defeat this threat that you're talking about, which is also the infiltration of the Assad regime?
Right. Again, a great question. Israel definitely will try to defend itself with all its might against the IRGC and the Quds Force. They need help though. They need to have support from Western countries, especially the U.S., to really stop not just the Quds Force in Syria, but really you have to stop them in Iraq, you have to stop them in Yemen, you have to stop them all over the region. And that cannot be done by Israeli alone. Israel is a small country, cannot be expected to do it by itself. Although they, in May they showed their courage and they did whatever they had to do to attack the
bases, all of the known bases.
All of the known bases at the same time, within 3 hours, all the known bases. They sent basically all of the Air Force to hit them all. For the long term, they do need support from not just the West, but also from the Arab allies, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and other countries in that region.
Do you think that's a possibility? Would we see that now there when we'll see Arab countries collaborating with Israel on this?
They're already doing it.
But in a way that you're talking about.
Yeah,
no, robust,
yes. If we are talking about a formal alliance between Saudi-led forces and Israelis and the U.S. into an Arab, Israeli, American-led security force, but it will take some time. But between now and then, in reality, they could coordinate everything they do together. And I think they have started doing that already.
They started doing that militarily.
Yes.
If we want to actually just now, after your book, it sounds really interesting. I'm definitely going to be reading your book.
Thank you.
It's very important for people to know what is this threat that we're dealing with, because there's a mixed information about the reality of these forces and how strong and how much presence they actually have on the ground. But let's go back to the administration, because this administration has been obviously tough on Iran. There's a lot of talks about the sanctions, but we haven't been hearing a lot about the sanctions, especially that we saw that there was some exceptions, that there were some countries that, especially the important countries for Iran, they went ahead and they gave them the exemption from these sanctions. What do you think of the effect of that?
Well, sanctions are an important tool in US's toolbox, but it cannot possibly be the only tool. Sanctions are effective up to a point. Definitely by sanctions alone, the US cannot stop IRGC and the Quds Force in the Middle East. Let me go back a little bit and tell you why. The Quds Force is organized as the extraterritorial branch of the Revolutionary Guards to act as an independent entity, even outlasting the Islamic Republic if Tehran should fall, for any number of reasons. Okay. Because what I mean by that is that the Quds Force has their own businesses outside the country. These are the front businesses, because the Quds Force maintains a network of associates who are non-combatant. These are not Shia militias, but these are associates all over the globe. In Middle East, they have their own either ownership or control of the shipping lines, airlines, banks, other businesses. Yes, these are front businesses for the Quds Force. So not that the Quds Force, I'm not saying that the Quds Force prefer Tehran falls, of course not, because Tehran gives them oil money, which they will lose if the regime in Iran falls. However, they are by design set up to outlast the Islamic Republic, even that. So that shows they have their own independent finances. They have, of course, 50,000 active Shia militias all over the Middle East, and there are about 150,000 other Arab youth who've been sent back to Iran, have seen the training, and they're ready to join that 50,000. So we are talking about these are IRGC's own numbers. We have about 200,000 armed Arab youth, Shia youth, who in the Middle East, who who can.
Where they're from, because we know that in Iraq they hate the Iranian regime. In Iraq they're angry at the Iranian regime.
Right.
This is the majority Shiite country.
Right, but you don't need to get all of the Shias.
Yes.
Yes, you get part of it. You get to those numbers. So they have their own Shia militias, Middle Eastern Shia militias. By the way, that figure 200,000 I gave you includes about 30,000, 40,000 Afghan.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Afghan and Pakistani. I'm talking about Shias,
Yes.
Pan-Shias.
Yes.
So they do have in that Middle East. They have caches of arms all over the place. And they have cadres, officers all over the place. So they can even outlast Islamic Republic. Let alone the sanctions by Washington. Sanctions are not going to destroy Quds Force presence in the Middle East alone. Is going to hurt them. Is going to decrease their oil revenues. But if Washington, if this White House is serious about countering growing influence of the Quds Force in the and IRGC in the region, they have to go more than sanctions. They have to disrupt their freedom of movement in the region. They have to stop their flights in open daylight. They fly from Tehran to Damascus and from Tehran to Beirut in 747s. What those 747s are carrying?
Yes.
Personnel or arms, material, or both. So they have to disrupt that.
And the U.S. is not doing that under
No,
this
we are not.
administration.
No,
Okay.
sanction itself is not going to resolve that issue.
Yes. When you said, I mean, that's interesting when you talk about the Quds forces outlasting the Iranian regime's lifespan, but what would that make them? I mean, are we talking about an ISIS-like militia if this happens? If there's no coverage, no umbrella by a regime, would that turn them into like another just a rogue terrorist sectarian militia like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS?
Much more potent than them.
Why?
Because the 200,000 Shia militias, Arabs, Pakistani, Afghan, I mentioned, some of them have gone into training 5 or 6 different times inside Iran, including training in advanced weaponries. So you have a large number of militant youth who are unhappy with the situation in their own countries, have been recruited by the Quds Force and have gone through extensive training. And then the foundations that IRGC owns inside Iran, these are economic foundations. IRGC controls about half the Iranian economy through those foundations. Almost all of them have branches in the Middle East. So they are doing businesses there. So they have that kind of a business
and that kind of income.
And then they have a network of thousands of associates, non-combatants, who are bankers, who are shoppers, who are...
and they're legitimate-looking people.
They're legitimate-looking people who are helping them. Is going to be much more potent force, the Quds Force, without Iran we're talking about, much more potent force than your regular rogue terrorist groups. Basically, they're going to be the headquarters of the Shia militancy in the Middle East for years and decades to come, with or without Tehran.
That's really dangerous. That's just really just scary to think about.
It is.
Now we see that there's a continuation of strikes and protests inside of Iran. It's been a year now. What do you make of the situation with the people? And why do we see that, despite that there's not a lot of attention, there's not a lot of support for these people, still they are protesting and risking their own lives?
The situation in Iran is really tough for a lot of Iranian people. You take away the people in power and the elite of the Islamic Republic, even the middle class, or at least the former middle class, is finding hard time to find support for their family. So this demonstration started last year. Last December, really as a protest against the living condition, but like any other dictatorial regimes, they have a tendency of immediately turning even economic protest into political issues by arresting their leaders, by torturing them, by threatening them. And so the demonstrations immediately turned against the regime with the slogans against the supreme leader, with the slogans to get out of Syria and bring your resources into Iran. As we had discussed before, these goes into waves. So we've seen a number of different waves of this demonstration in the past year. The Islamic Revolution in 1979 didn't happen in February 79. It really started in 77 with the wave of demonstration that culminated in the collapse of the Pahlavi regime in February 79. It didn't happen overnight, and I did not expect last year that the regime would collapse overnight, especially this regime.
Yeah, you said the same thing. You said they're going to continue.
I think is a continuous waves of these demonstrations until and when they gather more support from different strata they're doing it now because students are joining them in the student movements in campus and all of that, which is a very important step.
Yes.
And I wouldn't be surprised in 2019 and 2020 we see massive support for these. So I'm not counting that out. This is just the beginning of the movement. It's not the end of it.
What is your explanation for why the administration has not been taking any extra steps other than the economical sanctions?
I think they're getting, this White House is getting really bad advice from whoever advising them. This White House should have gone all the way in support of the protest, although they say they are supporting it morally, but should do it by practical means. If they go even against the IRGC alone, if this administration goes against the IRGC, stop their freedom of movement in Middle East, stop their ballistic missile program in Iran, stop their what they're doing, you're using ports and airports in the Arab world, including in Syria and including in Yemen. If they stop all of those and then really bring down the power of IRGC, that will be the biggest help they're doing the demonstration, because at the end of the day, the regime's means of suppressing the protest is the IRGC.
Exactly. If you read the economical map right now in Iran and you look at it, even though it's not enough, as you said, for the collapse of the regime now, but is there potential for the Iranian regime to kind of help the people a little bit to let them calm down, or if there's ways for them to maneuver somehow and get things to look better for the people, give them some hope somehow? Very
tough for them to do.
Why?
Demonstration started last December. That was before sanctions. Sanctions came, as a matter of fact, Trump administration left JCPOA in January, and the sanction didn't start until really in earnest until just about last month for the full sanctions on the 4th of November. But even before these sanctions and before U.S. left JCPOA, Iranian economy was in a state of very bad state. They had very high inflation, they had extremely high unemployment, and they had the recession already. Before the sanctions.
That's true.
So you had this very difficult situation for any economist to handle. You have inflation, and then you have recession at the same time. This stagflation type of the malaise is very difficult to handle. Then it came sanction on top of that and made their situation even worse. The Iranian regime is telling us that their oil, that the government revenues, which really depend on oil exports for most parts, the government revenues has been cut by more than a third. I mean, that's a huge chunk of the government expenses. So if this continues on, and there's no Obama's sanctions at least were coupled with some negotiations. So Iranian people, Iranian regime had the hope that probably something will happen at the end of it. No, these sanctions can go on forever. And an Iranian regime cannot afford doing that. They cannot afford pouring all these dollars into the black market to raise the value of real, to keep the value of real at the artificial low things. And definitely you don't have the money to answer all the economic problems people are facing. The regime is not just politically, but economically is bankrupt, really.
Mm-hmm. And there's no light in the end of the tunnel.
I don't
for the
see
Iranian
it.
regime
I don't
right
see
now,
it.
in
I
terms
don't
of
see it.
economics.
No, I see. The only thing I see in coming years is the change in the regime.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that regime can reform itself from within. They could not. They tried it for 30 years. Everything collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
All the reformist movements collapsed. The reformist presidents were thrown out, and all of that. And they don't now. They are losing all their international partners. Their partners internationally and regionally are people like Nasrallah of Lebanon, like Assad of Syria, like the Houthi of Yemen. These are not the kind of partners you need to come out of the crisis and to claim your place in the Middle East.
Exactly. What about the oil issue? So now we know that there's some question marks about the OPEC, and we know that Qatar said that they're going to be getting out of OPEC next year. How do you read? I mean, with the prices of oil also dropping, what do you expect? How that is going to affect the overall? Also, another basically a crunch that has nothing to do with the sanctions themselves.
Yes, with or without sanctions,
Yeah.
Countries who depend on oil in the region, including Iran, are in trouble for the very simple fact that the U.S. is now surpassed Saudi Arabia as the largest producer of oil. American oil, when last time in America we had that was about 75 years ago, if I was not here, but it was 75 years ago, if I read the history correctly. So America is now an exporter. I think the production of oil in this country has surpassed 11.5 million barrels a day, which is more than what Saudis do produce. So that alone is really changing the whole geopolitical situation in the region. If the West wanted to fight in Middle East because of oil, there is no oil needed to fight for. So that geopolitically will bring down the importance of those regimes. And if the prices keep falling or staying down, they're going to create economic problems. They should have known this long time ago and created an economy that would not depend on oil. But guess what? These regimes do not do that. They just want to get the crude oil out of the ground, sell it, and call it an economic plan, which is not.
Which is not. I want to ask you about the Iranian opposition, since this is a big thing in question now. Obviously, we see the opposition, the Mujahideen Khalq part. They've built up themselves in the media. They're very well known. While there's a lot of other parties who claim that Mujahideen Khalq have no popularity inside of Iran. And there are always questions about who else is there. They talk about the Green Movement. They talk about people who are from, the actual people who are protesting whatever they would want. But also there's the Shahstan, the Prince, Rida Pahlavi, and that, alternative or another opposition that is credible and has popularity inside of Iran. What would you make, if there's the distinction here, if we're trying to compare and contrast, how would you lay out the map of the support for the different opposition groups and legitimacy from within Iran?
You're asking great questions, very difficult to answer.
Thank you.
The main opposition forces should actually develop inside Iran. Because by definition, if they want to topple the government or change the government's behavior, they have to be on the ground in Iran present. You can do certain things to support opposition from outside the country, but that's a really limited thing you can do. You can get, of course, try to mobilize public relations in the region and in the vote, which is very important in support of the opposition groups inside Iran and the protesters inside Iran. But that's only effective to a point. They have to be present. They have to lead those. Now, are the current oppositions who are outside the country, like the Pahlavi, like the loyalist opposition, or like the Mujahideen Khalq, MEK, could have their own internally inside Iran organizations start leading parts of those demonstrations, part of those protests in future? That's a good question. If they can do that, then they become a bona fide opposition groups. Outside the country, opposition is very much divided. Mujahideen,
Outside of the country,
outside
yes,
the country.
yes.
Mujahideen seems to be the most organized of all of them. Not only as far as recruiting and having large base outside the country, as far as membership is concerned, but we are in those of us who are in media and think tank communities see them active, very much active in all these activities for the past 30, 40 years, not just for the past year.
They've been preparing
They've been preparing for this, so they can if they can somehow re-establish themselves inside the country, they would be a force to deal with. Pahlavi, the Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, on the other hand, has an advantage of his name and his former position. He was the Crown Prince of Iran, and his last name, Pahlavi, has a nostalgia for the people in Iran who has lost good old days in the country. Again, nostalgia is very important. Name recognition in politics, we know, is very important. The former positions of a Crown Prince is very important for him. But in themselves, they're not going to resolve any issue unless they have a presence within the country and leading demonstrations and protests. Khomeini did not come to power just because he was sitting in Paris. Khomeini came to power because while he was sitting in Paris, there were his supporters were organized within the mosques that he controlled from Paris. And so when he came back to Iran, millions and millions of people were marching on the streets. Some of them were just there as a short-term allies, but a lot of them, they were fooled to believe that this guy is going to bring democracy in Iran. So he had that base.
Yes.
So for Mujahideen and for Pahlavi and for any other opposition, secular, non-Islamist, non-royalist opposition
Are
too,
the Mujahideen Khalq Islamic, in your opinion?
Well, they do believe in Islam. Now, how much of that belief they want to incorporate into their governing principle? They're saying none. But they have to show that because people might not believe that.
People are concerned because now in Iran, when you look at what's happening on the ground, in Iran there's, during the Shah time, as of, people that I know who are experts, they told me there was like hundreds of people in every mosque every Friday.
Right.
Now there's none.
Right.
Nobody goes to the mosques in Iran anymore.
Right.
There's a turn off. There's no appetite for Islamists.
Well, Islamic theology has lost its value, has lost its romanticism, if you will. At one time, about 50 years ago, a Khomeini type could talk about, let's go back to the early days of Islam, let's bring justice to Iran based on those old caliphates, but their own rule in Iran, Islamic Republic, and people like Taliban, like Al-Qaeda, and like Daesh did a number to show the people what that Islamic caliphate looks like, and people now do not want to have anything to do with Islam. Islamic ideology is losing, not only in Iran, I think is losing the youth across the Middle East.
The Middle East, and that's something that is happening, on the ground, like grassroots.
On the ground, and then there
Why do you think?
Because of what Islamists did. They failed miserably when they came to power. Like what Taliban did in Afghanistan. The first thing they did, they stopped education of women. What Islamic Republic did inside Iran, they just basically throw out everybody into the prison or out of the country if they were against their ideology. And Al-Qaeda and Daesh, we know what they did. They were great and cutting heads than governing in spaces that they had under their control. So Islamism have lost its glare in the Middle East. And it's up really to opposition, to secular opposition, to replace the Islamist groups. And I think if we don't see any of them there because they've been under pressure from both the governments and from the Islamist movements. But in the coming years, we're going to see a number of them coming from those movements inside those countries, including Iran, new secular groups coming to power.
Coming to power. Thank you so much, Nader. It's always wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you all the time.
Thank you. That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching The Access. Good night.